We shall bring you further news as quickly as we...
My God. This is the end of diplomacy.
Welcome to the next stop on our historical journey, the 19th century, the golden age of both diplomacy and technological innovation. If there is one quote which has been the most frequently used in literature and discussion on technology and diplomacy, it is a quote made by Lord Palmerston when he received in the 1850s the first telegraph. And we will hear his words in a few seconds, animated by the latest AI application, which try to basically depict his voice based on the photo. We'll play it now and we'll start our discussion today with the quote from Lord Palmerston.
My God. This is the end of diplomacy.
Diplomacy survived this first challenge, and it is live, very alive and kicking today. Therefore, for our journey, it is important to keep that in mind, that all of those reflections about the end of diplomacy, end of negotiation, didn't materialize in its fullness. But before we dive deep in this golden age of diplomacy and technology, 19th century, let us see what we traveled so far. And if you can recall, and if you were with us on this journey, you can recall that we traveled through different epochs, from prehistory and first forms of proto-diplomacy through early civilization of ancient East, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and their invention of writing, to ancient Greece, Rome, and Byzantine Empire with its rich legacy for diplomacy. Our last stop before the summer was in Italy, discussing Renaissance diplomacy. The age of Renaissance Italian diplomacy ended in 1494 with the French invasion of Italy. But as we will see, Renaissance diplomacy techniques and approaches had already started spreading beyond the Alps, throughout Europe. And before we dive deep into this telegraph diplomacy or 19th century period, we'll make a brief survey of the main developments in the intermediate period between, let's say, the end of Renaissance diplomacy, early 16th century, and the start of a golden age of diplomacy and technology in 19th century. This is just a quick bridge. This intermediate period was shaped by the Reformation movement and religious wars, out of which Central Europe came out divided, while around it, new much more centralized states, in particular France, England, and Austria, appeared. In this intermediate period, we'll focus on two remarkable personalities who made a long-lasting impact on diplomacy, Hugo Grotius and Cardinal Richelieu, and one important event, the Peace of Westphalia, frequently referred in international relations and discussion on history and diplomacy. By the 16th century, the Christian Commonwealth had disappeared. Without the key roles of Pope and the Holy Roman Empire as the ultimate arbiter in international conflicts, there were conceptual gaps in international affairs. This Dutch philosopher, Hugo Grotius, was the first thinker to offer comprehensive concept to fill these gaps. He introduced the school of natural law and later on international law. According to Grotius, we as individuals have a natural right in order to protect ourselves. You will see that some of these impacts influenced later Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan. We are entitled to these natural rights as human beings. Through natural law, Grotius started to establish a minimum moral consensus that could help society build itself and overcome the divisions of the escalating religious conflicts. Grotius, in particular, starting building his construction with the notion that individual people empowered by natural rights are sovereign. Sovereign people create sovereign nations, opposing the, at that time, existing idea that sovereignty is a divine right given to kings by God. On this foundation of personal sovereignty, he built the first theory of international law in his work on the law of war and peace. Another important book by Hugo Grotius also had a lasting impact in the field of diplomacy, international law. It is Mare Liberum, the Free Seas, where he formulated the new principle that the sea was international territory and all nations were free to use it for seafaring trade. Obviously, he was influenced by interest of, at that time, strong maritime powers, Britain and the Netherlands. The teaching of Grotius influenced the construction of the Peace of Westphalia, of which we'll hear about a bit later. But let's make one historical parallel. His notion of sovereignty of individuals is re-emerging today in discussion around sovereignty of us, individuals, over our personal data and digital destiny. In a way, we can say that Grotius' thinking is eternal. The second important person for this period of diplomacy and technology is Cardinal Richelieu, a French statesman. He was another person whose legacy remained visible until today. Namely, Richelieu developed the idea of diplomacy as a continuous process and permanent activity. The idea of permanence of diplomacy started developing gradually in the Renaissance diplomacy, if you can recall from our last discussion, with permanent ambassador exchange by Italian city-states. But it took full form in the time of Richelieu. Institutionally, in 1626, Richelieu established the first Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is in more or less the same format we know today. He also argued that diplomacy should be governed by raison d'etat, national interest. Interests of states are primary and eternal. You can see in that context a bit of continuity from the Peloponnese War and Thucydides to the realist school till today, to the realist school's international relations, and the real dilemma as we are seeing crises unfolding in Afghanistan between national interest and the broader global public interest. National interest should be above sentiments, prejudice, and ideologies. Richelieu was the main architect of the expansion of French diplomacy. By the 18th century, the French language has become the lingua franca of diplomacy and has remained it so until recently, why now today increasingly it is surpassed by English. Therefore, we have these two personalities and we have one important event in this intermediary period. It is Peace of Westphalia. Westphalia is probably one of the most frequently used historical references in modern relations and politics, especially related to the modern state system. The Peace of Westphalia is the collective name for two peace treaties signed in October 1648 in Westphalian cities of Osnabrück and Münster. They ended the 30 Years' War and brought peace to the space of Holy Roman Empire, closing a period of European history when approximately 8 million people were killed. It was really, really massive atrocity. The Peace of Westphalia established the sovereignty of states as independent political units. You can see the line between Grotius and Westphalia. The system based on nation states replaced the previous one based on the ultimate sovereignty of the Roman Catholic Pope and the Holy Roman Empire. The Westphalia peace negotiation began after all sides in the war, 30 years war, it was quite a long war, got exhausted of fighting and destruction. Ultimately, they reached a compromise which did not satisfy anyone, which is a good basis for any compromise. The peace itself was the result of very long negotiation that lasted 4 years. The first 6 months were dedicated to agreeing on the question of procedure, which was highly controversial due to the participation of 200 rulers. You can remember that at that time, nowadays Germany was divided in many, many small entities. And there were more than 1,000 diplomats. Diplomacy was already quite a prominent profession. Westphalia was a milestone event marking the beginning of modern era with sovereign states, which has lasted more or less till today. The 18th century was a period when European diplomacy tried hard to maintain balance between the 5 great powers: Britain, France, Austria, Russia, and Prussia. The French Revolution and attempts of Napoleon I to conquer Europe have shaken the continent state system and paved the way for the Congress of Vienna. Now, the Congress of Vienna was one of the biggest events in the history of diplomacy. It laid the basis for the peace that lasted almost 100 years till the outbreak of the First World War. What was interesting, the Congress was organized in quite a relaxed atmosphere with saloons, banquets, balls, entertainment at high level. Cuisine was exceptional, delegations were big, and the Austrians paid great attention to this social aspect of this event. They also paid financially a lot. Again, like in a previous period with Grotius and Rochelier, we have 2 important personalities marking the Vienna Congress. One was again French, Prince Talleyrand, French Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Clemens von Metternich, Austrian Minister of Foreign Affairs. They were the key shapers of the peace deal in Vienna. The peace talks were organized in order to deal with Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, and Talleyrand managed almost the impossible. Being on the side of the losing power, he managed to influence to a large extent the outcome of a negotiation and proven an able negotiator can defeat French interest even when France was very weak. This is one lesson for the future of diplomacy and for current era, that at the time of the end of the wars, it is very important to accommodate losing side as investment for the future stability and avoidance of the conflict. In addition to Talleyrand, Metternich brilliantly mastered his dual role of social representation and political leadership. His moderation of the Congress produced a long-lasting European order. The final act of the Congress of Vienna compromised all the agreements in one instrument, and it was signed on the 9 June 1815. The Congress of Vienna, as we indicated, survived the test of time for 100 years without the major global war, almost, well, till the outbreak of the First World War. This was diplomatic side. Let's say now quickly, what was the technological basis? On the technology side, the 19th century was an era of great scientific and technological breakthroughs. We can recall many, many great discoveries. Also, it was an era of the flourishing arts. But for our discussion, we'll focus on the invention of the telegraph as one of the key communication tools. Now, an interesting controversy starts even with the name. The word telegraph derived from the Greek words tele, at a distance, and graphein, to write. But at that time, a variety of other terms were used or considered for telegraph, among others, tachygraph, from the Greek word tachos, meaning speed, and again, graphea, writing. That proposal highlighted the temporal aspect of communications. Arguments over the name of new invention center around focus on this spatial and temporal aspect. Ultimately, spatial aspect prevailed, and we have today name telegraph for that great invention that changed 19th century and humanity for a long time. The first mechanical telegraph was invented in the 1792 in France by Claude Chappe. It consisted of towers built in line across the countryside. Some of these towers you can find, many are nowadays in the nice vineyards, and you can in the wine houses and the wine estates. And you have the, to facilitate the message transmission, Chappe developed a 92 symbol code book. For that time, the communication speed was incredible, as the message could be transmitted from Paris to Lille, which is distance of 230 kilometers, in 10 minutes. This system was invented during the French Revolution and used later on for military purposes during Napoleonic Wars. By 1845, France had some 5,000 kilometers of semaphore communication line. In addition to military use, the main civilian use of telegraph was the reporting of the numbers of national lottery, which coincidentally was also a good source of revenue for the running of the telegraph system. Therefore, online gambling or online gaming has a long, long history till mechanic telegraph in France. Great Britain and Germany also developed mechanical telegraph system, again, mainly for the military use. And we can make one interesting historical parallel here, which is waiting for researchers to be enlightened. Parallel between Chappe's mechanical telegraph and Minitel, a French predecessor of the internet. Similarly, the two inventions, one in the 18th century and the other in 20th century, gave France a slight advantage. But in both cases, France missed the opportunity to capitalize on it. The mechanical telegraph was run over by the electrical one, mainly developed in Britain and later on United States, and Minitel was replaced by the internet. Therefore, it remains one interesting research topic of early tech innovation, followed by delayed societal and economic implementation. The invention of the electric telegraph, therefore we are moving now from electric from the mechanic Chappe's telegraph towards the electric one. And this is important shift. The invention of the electric telegraph was more a process than a moment of creative illumination. Different countries and individuals are claiming credit for the invention. And the electric telegraph is often called nowadays the internet of 19th century or Victorian internet, as Tom Standage wrote in his book. And you can follow interview with him in build up to today's session. The English historian Robert Sabine described this process as in the following way. The electric telegraph did not, strictly speaking, have an inventor. It grew little by little towards perfection, with each inventor adding his bit. It is also an interesting parallel with the internet. But let us mention some of them, some of the inventions that influence development of electric telegraph. The initial idea of functional principle of transmitting a message over distance was introduced by Chappe, as we saw already. Electric batteries invented by Italian Volta in at the beginning of 19th century were an important pre-invention. The German physicist Sommering experimented with electrochemical reaction and some proto-version of the telegraph. In 1820, ampere, we can, you know that the unit of ampere which is used in days, conceptualized a needle telegraph device with needle that can write. An important step in the process of invention of the electric telegraph was the work of the Russian diplomat Baron Pavel Schilling. And this is an interesting topic to see how diplomats influence scientific and technological developments. Probably one of the, before Schilling was French diplomat, Jean Nicot, who brought tobacco from Portugal to France, and the term nicotine is named after him. But let's get back to Pavel Schilling. During his posting in Germany, probably he had quite a bit of time, he experimented and developed an electric telegraph very early in 1832. Later on, when he returned to St. Petersburg, capital of Russia, he managed to connect via electric telegraph a number of buildings of the Russian chief admiralty. And it was probably one of the first examples of effective use of electric telegraph. In Britain, in 1838, Cook and Whetstone were first to use telegraph for commercial purposes by establishing a more efficient communication among the growing network of railway lines. As all the trains use the same railway lines, the exact location of each train was of the utmost importance for the normal functioning of the system. Telegraphy, after this use of telegraph, started spreading very quickly to other commercial activities, including trade and financial transactions. Now, in this great community of inventors, we should add 1844 and Samuel Morse, he is incorrectly credited as inventor of the telegraph. But he did one important invention. First, he managed to establish the first telegraph line between Washington and Baltimore. And Morse's main contribution to telegraphy was the invention of a special code named Morse code, named after him, for exchanging text messages over telegraph line. In the period between 1858 to 1866, there were various attempts to lay a transatlantic cable to connect United States and Europe, which resulted in establishing of a fully reliable link in 1866. After this moment, the New York and London stock exchanges became linked and frequently exchanged information. This boosted economic activities enormously. Let us make a quick pause here before we continue and hear from Natasha if there are any comments and questions from our audience. Natasha, over to you.
Thank you, Jovan, for the floor. We have a very international crowd with us today, all the way from Japan and Australia to Peru and South Africa. So it's a great pleasure to see all of them with us. So far, we have received some very interesting comments and questions from the audience. So to start with, reflecting on the importance of the environment in which discussions take place, Sylvie noted that the environment is very important. She also noted that many negotiations nowadays are held virtually and that the agreements reached are not as robust as when diplomats could interact physically. Ryan also agreed that having an environment which is calm and relaxed is a factor towards better diplomatic relations. Simon, reflecting also on this point, asked whether arts such as music or theater also played a role in contributing to the relaxed atmosphere at the Congress of Vienna. And Ginger finally noted that it is very difficult nowadays to find an atmosphere that is calm and relaxed without isolation. That would be all from the floor.
Thank you, Natasha, and a great welcome to our really diverse participation. Let me comment on the question of general environment, and we will discuss it now in more details. Therefore, I won't focus, put a lot of time. After going deeper into that, we can have another sort of iteration of questions and comments. But let me focus quickly on the question of the importance of arts, entertainment, social, emotional aspects of negotiations. There are two peace talks that could be compared. One is Vienna Congress, where there was a deliberate focus on developing a relaxed atmosphere in order to discuss very serious issues after the Napoleonic War. And Austro-Hungarian Empire invested heavily into that time Austria invested heavily into the entertainment. There were a lot of stories and interesting, intriguing love affairs, parties, and everything else. But it was one of the reasons for a very good peace treaty at that time. The other example of the serious scientific evidence-based policy treaty was the Versailles peace negotiation after the First World War. At that time, all delegations had a lot of scientists and statisticians. I'm not arguing that we don't need a science and we don't need facts. They had many maps. They calculated exactly in the famous the article on the German reparation, which was the basis for instability and the failure of Weimar Republic and ultimately Second World War. Therefore, Vienna, relaxing, entertaining, very serious and good treaty. Versailles, very evidence-based, very scientific, and ultimately failure of diplomacy. The Second World War, we know what's happened, and we are in a way fixing the results of Versailles till our very days. Therefore, as we are discussing these issues about facts, data, evidence in diplomacy, obviously it's a matter of our era, we should use them, but we should be very careful when it comes to human engagement, empathy, and building trust, which is the basis for all negotiation. This is just the quick point to this excellent question. Let us then continue with our journey. So far, this was the technological basis of this year. And now, before we focus on the impact of diplomacy, let me mark one anniversary, and I'm emotional on this point. Today, 25 years ago, I wrote a text. You can find it online on information, technology, and diplomacy. Last week, I read this text with a mix of really great nostalgia and nervousness. I was very nostalgic about that era in 1996 of the great tech optimism, possibility. The sky was the limit. And it's important to have that atmosphere sometimes, an overall spirit, the end of the Cold War, cooperation in the world. The world has changed since then. In addition to nostalgia, I was very nervous. You know, the time is the best and toughest judge. And I was wondering if what I wrote in that time, in order to conceptualize impact between emerging digital technology, internet first websites were just creating, and diplomacy, if it passed the test of time. I was relaxed when I realized that what was outlined in that booklet, 3 impacts of technology or interplays of technology and diplomacy on geopolitical environment, of emergence of new diplomatic topics, and the use of new tools for diplomats. Therefore, this now short history of 25 years, proven methodology will be used for our discussion today, for our discussion on technology or telegraph and diplomacy. And we'll start first with changes in geopolitical environment for diplomatic activities. First, the telegraph at that time, like internet today, affected distribution of power and led to winners and losers. I will give you one example, interesting example. Prior to the introduction of telegraph, the big banking family Rothschild which is still powerful today, developed a communication system which connected the main economic centers and the banking centers in Europe through the use of couriers and the carrier pigeons. This network gave them a competitive advantage, which disappeared when the telegraph was introduced. And James the Rothschild complained once, it was a crying shame the telegraph has been established. One of the telegraph's unforeseen and I guess unplanned consequences is the impact telegraph had on the emancipation of women. Namely, women were often employed as the telegraph operators. And with secure jobs, greater rights, and possibility of education, women in industrialized countries started getting more important positions. And there are some research and analysis of linkages between this technological development and early movements for the emancipation of movement. Another element which shaped that, let's say, broader environment in which diplomats had to operate was techno-optimism. British ambassador Edward Thornton wrote, "Steam was the first olive branch offered to us by science. Then came a still more effective olive branch, this wonderful electric telegraph, which enables every man who happens to be within reach of wire to communicate instantly with his fellow men all over the world and ultimately contribute to the peace." You can see that it was also dynamics when the internet arrived. Great optimism about the future, about the end of wars, and unfortunately, it was not completely justified, as we are seeing nowadays with various misuses of technology. At that time, there was also techno-skepticism. Some rulers were cautious of the potential social impact of the telegraph. For example, Russian Tsar Nicola I considered the telegraph to be subversive. He was afraid of democratizing potentials that telegraph dissemination of information can have, and he even declined an offer by Morse to develop the Russian first telegraph line. One of the results was that Russia lagged greatly behind the other major powers. The last and most tangible impact of telegraph was a cable geostrategy. Namely, the control of a telegraph cable became the crucial geostrategical issue. The control of the cables meant the control of information, an important source of power. Big powers, in particular Britain, laid cables in order to create their own communication infrastructure. Initially, until 1880s, the cable rush was mainly inspired by commercial and telecommunication needs. Towards the end of the century, Great Britain controlled most of the global telegraph network, approximately 90%. And there were a number of reasons led towards that dominant position of Britain. First, there was a need for Britain. It started laying cables in order to facilitate communication with its remote colonies, mainly with India. Another factor that helped Britain was the control of the seas, because they had to lay submarine telegraph cables without any major obstacle. The high cost of developing and maintaining its telegraph network was partly compensated with commercial traffic, since the most strategic telegraph outposts coincided with the main trade routes at the time: Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus, Alexandria, Aden, Singapore, Hong Kong. And British Empire smartly used, for example, East India investment and investment of private or semi-private companies for the development of the cables. All in all, Britain developed a considerable lead during this period and established a starting advantage that was very difficult for many countries to reach in the forthcoming decades. Other countries realized relatively late both the importance of having a telegraph network and the extent of British dominance. Although, as we saw, France pioneered the development of the telegraph, especially mechanic telegraph, it was a latecomer in the development of global telegraph cable networks. It was only after a series of crises, Tonkin, Siam, Fashoda, that the French parliament started to take the problem of the lack of its own telegraph network and British dominance in this field. They started to taking it very seriously. But one event was a watershed event. During the 1890 Fashoda crisis in Africa, French plan to control Africa from the west, Dakar, to the east, Djibouti, clashed with the British ambition to establish north-south control over the continent from Cairo to Cape Town. Two colonial projects collided in Fashoda, a small village in present-day Sudan. Even though France had an advantage on the field, it didn't have the means to communicate this to its headquarters in Paris. On the other hand, the British conveyed false information to London about, in particular, fake, difficult position of the French troops in Fashoda. The technological advantage was so strong that the French officials were forced to ask their British counterparts in the military conflict to send a message to Paris via the British telegraph. And one of the results of Fashoda crisis is that basically France decided to withdraw and Britain won this battle. After this crisis, France and Germany realized that they have to close the cable gap and started developing their own global cable networks. The United States, as it starting emergence as a global political and economic power, started also developing its own cable networks. And there were various interesting developments in this concept. For example, unsuccessful attempt to establish for almost 10 years a transatlantic link are often cited as one of the reasons for the United States' decision to purchase Russian America, Alaska. Faced with difficulty in establishing submarine transatlantic link, Western Union President Hiram Sibley urged the purchase of Alaska in order to establish a 16,000-mile land-based wire between US and Europe going through Siberia. This terrestrial telegraph scheme was abandoned in 1868 when the finally transatlantic cable started working, but Alaska was purchased and it remained a part of United States till today. The use of the telegraph gradually also became a part of international life, negotiation, and diplomatic tactics. Therefore, the whole environment for diplomacy has been reshaped by new power distribution via cables, by new elites, by new ways of shaping the global discussion. Now we will shift to the question of new topics on diplomatic agenda. Telegraph at that time, like internet today, was becoming important topic to be discussed. There was a need to regulate how to use telegraph. And telegraph politics appear, or telegraph diplomacy or governance, if you use nowadays terminology, appear very early in the mid-19th century. The first agreements were made. And the first agreements were made, the network of bilateral agreements between the city-states in Germany, which at that time, Germany was divided into many small states. In 1849, Prussia and Saxony concluded the first bilateral agreement which was followed by others. Only 1 year later, the German state and Austria established the Austro-German Telegraph Union. Other European countries started concluding bilateral agreements too. This led toward the establishment of a regional organization, the West European Telegraph Union. It was established in 1855 by Belgium, France, the Kingdom of Sardinia, and Switzerland. Other countries subsequently joined the WETU, but all of these bilateral patchy agreements could not keep pace with the intensity of technological developments. The main part of this agreement is to agree about standards and way of exchanging messages between different telegraph systems. It was clear that there was a need for comprehensive multilateral agreement. And the first arrangement was adopted in 1865, very early in Paris, with the establishment of the International Telegraph Union, ITU. And you're familiar with today's ITU, the only different T doesn't stand for telegraph, but stands for telecommunication. In 1868, the International Bureau of Telegraph Administration was established in Bern, which is considered to be the first permanent international organization. One of the main international legal issues raised in 1865 at the Paris Conference was the neutral status of submarine telegraph cables in the case of war. If you can recall, France and Germany were lagging behind, and therefore they requested neutrality of submarine telegraph cables in the case of conflict. The main opponent and ultimately side which managed to prevail was Great Britain, since Britain controlled most of submarine cables, and it had technology for managing them, including the first cable cutting tools and devices. Incidentally, they are discussed today as well. Cables, telegraph cable remained outside the regulation covering the conduct of war, and that remains open issue till today. Even today, there is no neutrality of cables in the case of the conflicts of the war. And it is becoming increasingly important issue. I'm sure it will come to policy agenda. But you can see discussion started almost 2 centuries ago. Many important political decisions, discussion, which influenced the future development of telegraph were adopted at the next diplomatic conference. After Paris, the next conference was held in St. Petersburg in Russia in 1875. One of the most controversial issues in St. Petersburg was the control of the content of telegraph communication. And you can see also parallel content infrastructure parallel to internet. While the conference participants from the US and UK promoted the principle of the privacy of telegraph correspondence, Russia and Germany insisting on limiting this privacy in order to protect state security, public order, and public morality. A compromise was reached through an age-old diplomatic technique of diplomatic ambiguity. While Article 2 of St. Petersburg Convention guarantees the privacy of telegraph communication, what UK and US wanted, Article 7 limited this privacy and introduced the possibility of state intervention and censorship. The United States refused to sign the convention because of the Article 7, so-called censorship article. The introduction of new topics on diplomatic agenda influenced the organization of diplomatic services and emergence of new posts and new specialization dealing with this scientific and telegraphic issue. And today, where we discuss digital diplomacy and impact new digital diplomats that have to negotiate cybersecurity, privacy, we should recall that our far predecessor had a similar dilemma. Now we'll make a quick pause here and see from Natasha if there are any comments on these two elements, question of the changing geopolitical environment for diplomatic activities and new topics on diplomatic agenda before we dive deep into the question of the new tools that diplomats started using.
Thank you, Jovan. The chat discussion actually continued on the environment in which discussions take place. Richard Hill noted that the key element contributing to the calm and friendly atmosphere of the Vienna Congress was that it was about dismantling the outcome of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic invasion. And he noted that there was general consensus at the conference regarding the desired outcome with regards to the national boundaries and the ruling monarchies. Also said that the conference in itself was not a long-term success and that the status quo was again challenged in 1830 and 1848. Referring to the communication security, Simon highlighted that there must have been enormous changes in how communication security is being discussed as we can see nowadays. Over to you, Jovan.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Simon and Richard. Yes, definitely, Richard. There was a political context of the aristocratic power, basically stopping on trying to control impact of the French Revolution, which was extended by Napoleon. Therefore, his defeat was used to reestablish the ancient regime and the status quo around that. And Simon, thank you for your comment on cybersecurity. Okay, then it was we did a discussion on the geopolitical environment, cables, geopolitical strategy. We discussed new topics, negotiating telegraph agreements, emergence of ITU. And we are now moving to the new tools of diplomacy. It was already in the 1850s that the telegraph started to be used as a tool in diplomatic services. The telegraph was initially used in diplomacy for internal communication between diplomatic mission and headquarters. This also included communication, personal, ceremonial, and organizational matters. We already quoted the reaction of the Prime Minister Lord Palmerston when he received the first telegraph. He said, yes, this is the end of diplomacy. Diplomacy survived, as we know. In 1866, the United States State Department sent the cable to the US mission in Paris, in France. The encrypted message that passed through British and French cables did not prove to have any diplomatic importance, but it will go down in the history of diplomacy and technology as one of the most expensive experiments in tech diplomacy till today. The cost of dispatch of this telegram was $20,000 at that time, while the total budget of the US State Department was $150,000. Eventually, State Department didn't want to pay this basically bill, and it led to the question to the court, and the court decided, the Supreme Court, that they should pay for it. There was also a question of demoralization of diplomats, and one British diplomat said, hey, we are at the end of the wire. We are not anymore negotiating with independence. Diplomacy also frequent diplomats complained the lack of time for proper answers, and they essentially wanted to complain about impact of diplomacy on their daily work. But I will focus here on three telegrams that shaped to the large extent diplomatic history. And these telegrams are first M's telegram, which Bismarck misused or faked. At that time, the Prussian king wanted to reduce tension in France, and Bismarck needed the conflict in order to have to unite Germany in 1871. And he misused the telegram report which was sent from the Ems, where the Prussian king met French ambassador. And it provoked the reaction, intentional reaction by France, and ultimately war and unification of Germany in 1871. Zimmermann telegram became a part of history because it's another important influence, the US to abandon its neutrality and to enter First World War in 1916. The telegram was sent by German foreign minister Zimmermann to German ambassador in Mexico, allegedly asking him to propose to Mexico, then in exchange to joining Germany, Mexico will receive after the war some territories in California. British intelligence faked this telegram, and then it was publicized, and it became one of the trigger for the US entries in the First World War. Another important development was during the July crisis at the beginning of the First World War, when unskilled use of telegraph made a lot of confusions between, in particular, Berlin and St. Petersburg, where the conciliatory telegraph was passing with the more aggressive telegraphs. Therefore, what's happened, there are now serious researches that that confusion was one of the triggers for the contribute to the outbreak of the First World War. What are the main conclusions? What we can learn from history? First is the question of the need for urgent replies. The speed of transfer of the message has been linked to the urgency of reply. In the case of telegram, and today with internet. If a message travels for months, one can afford time to prepare a proper response. This situation changed with the telegraph, and this change remained till our time. The immediacy of the sending of messages required immediate response. And this impact on the timing of diplomatic work can potentially lead towards hasty and sometimes not properly prepared responses. The second aspect is the problem of coordinating communication. Urgency leads towards the problem of very often a telegram would arrive in the wrong order, creating considerable confusion with important consequences for example, outbreak of the First World War. During a delicate exchange on the Alabama dispute, the US Foreign Secretary Granville warned his counterpart, the British Prime Minister Gladstone, of this risk. He said, "This telegraphic work is despairing. It will be a mercy if we don't get into some confusion." Telegraph also created the need to prepare concise decision. It was expensive medium, so the content of each telegram had to be carefully considered. Diplomats had to improve the quality of diplomatic reporting. They had to abandon long and descriptive memos and master the skill of concise and precise writing. This is one of historical examples of how technology influenced style and etiquette. Another impact is the emergence of foreign policy bureaucracy. Although the first ministries of foreign affairs were established earlier, their number increased towards the end of the 19th century as a result of bureaucratic expansion. French diplomacy grew from 70 diplomats in 1840 to 170 at the end of the century. The foreign ministry achieved the shape that it has more or less retained till today. It consisted of geographical departments handling bilateral relations. There was entrance exam, which gradually replaced family ties as the main recruitment method, and new diplomats were trained in diplomatic academies. A sense of diplomatic profession started prevailing. Telegraph also influenced centralization of the diplomacy. Easier communication via telegraph and well-equipped ministries led to centralization of diplomatic services. Previously, independent diplomatic missions came under control of their headquarters. Instruction could be easily sent via telegraph, and diplomats were on the other side of wire. In general, statesmen and diplomats were essentially unprepared for the sudden appearance of this new technology, which overwhelmed them and contributed to the fact that they ceased to be the creators of policy and became more and more followers of events, which were getting out of their control. Unprepared to handle the new telegraph technology, diplomats who used to meet and manage international peace through direct communication suddenly became involved in the frenetic world of modern diplomacy conducted via telegraphs and telephones. The period after the Vienna Congress was decisive for the development in diplomacy. It was influenced heavily by technology. Telegraph, later on telephone. In this period, the basis was laid for the diplomacy we have today, the infrastructure, embassies, ministries, communication, diplomatic reporting. By studying this period, we can try and hopefully succeed to avoid mistakes that were made in the past and to develop some sort of smart approaches to technology and diplomacy, not driven just by technological possibilities, but more by the main function of diplomacy as tools, as approach to solve conflicts in modern society through negotiation and through compromise. We are now gradually, we will finish our discussion on this stop of our journey. And as always, following the tradition, we will have a drink. Today, the drink is a champagne, but there is a bit of a complex story because I got 3 glasses for champagne. And as you know, champagne is used a lot in diplomacy. And there is a story that this glass was initially used in France, later on replaced with the flute glass and having now the tulip glass. There were now a lot of interesting stories how champagne, this great, another great French invention, moved into diplomacy, and how it was heavily and a lot of used in Vienna during the peace negotiations. Now, without further ado, I will probably use this tulip, which nowadays prevail, and I'm sure there will be an interesting discussion in our online space about the shape of glasses and the impact of champagnes on diplomacy at that time, diplomacy today, and diplomacy in the future. In particular, impact on creating human context in which trust, engagement, and empathy can be developed as a key aspect for successful and long-lasting impact of diplomacy. With all of these historical parallels and discussion, I would like to drink for your health, for your success, and for the enjoyable start of diplomatic and academic year in September. Cheers.
We shall bring you further news as quickly as we have.